Well, good Sunday morning or Sunday afternoon, whichever is the case. I want to welcome you to the sermon for today. It's going to be based in Luke chapter 12, and we're going to be talking about something that happened with a situation where Jesus was teaching. Luke's very good about framing his lessons and telling us what's going on before and sometimes even after the text he's talking to us about. He will even frame them sometimes and tell us about who was the ruler at the particular time, what their name was. And he does that somewhat here in Luke chapter 12. In Luke 12, Jesus is teaching the multitudes, and he talks to them about being careful about the leaven of the scribes and the Pharisees. And he goes on to talk about some lessons regarding the subject of the Holy Spirit. He's talking about the Spirit and the blasphemy of the Spirit when someone in the crowd speaks up and says, "Rabbi, tell my brother to divide the inheritance with me." And this is one of those situations where somebody has something else on their mind and they're really not listening to the lesson, I guess, because this just kind of blurts out all of a sudden. I've done some safety talks with young kids about fire safety back when I was on the volunteer fire department in Newalla. And there were times when I would finish my talk and demonstration and say, "Does anyone have a question?" And I remember one time a little boy raised his hand and I said, "Yes, what's your question?" And he said, "My dog had puppies last night." And I learned that sometimes a person's mind can be somewhere entirely different during a lesson. And that happens to Jesus. Well, what Jesus does is to not lecture this person upon interrupting and not having his mind on the lesson. What Jesus does is what a great teacher does, and that is he goes to where this person is and he teaches the lesson that this person needs to hear at this time. The problem with this gentleman is that he was guilty of covetousness. And Jesus is going to tell a story about covetousness and greed all in one. The story is going to be about a rich man. And we're told that in this passage, beginning at verse 13 through basically the end of the chapter is what we're going to cover, that Jesus tells us that he had a lot of land. It was very productive. And after all this productive output by his land, he found out he didn't have enough room to store his crops. So he asked himself, "What am I going to do?" And then he came to the conclusion, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to tear down my buildings and I'm going to build bigger ones. And after I finish, I'm going to say to my soul, "Soul, you have many goods laid up for many years to come. Take your ease, eat, drink, and be merry." And Jesus said at this point, God's going to enter into the story because God's going to say to him, "You fool, this very night your soul is required of you, and now who will own what you prepared?" And Jesus said, "So is the man who lays up treasures for himself and is not rich toward God." Whenever Jesus said this, "So is the man," or "Thus are the ones who are like this," it's a warning not only to the people of his day, particularly that man that interrupted the lesson, but it's a warning for us as well. There are some things that the rich man did that basically Jesus is saying, don't do this. And Luke is going to follow up this particular story by telling us some things that Jesus taught his disciples about what they should do instead. First of all, we're going to look at what this rich man did wrong. First of all, he had a surplus. He had more than he could handle. He needed to store it somewhere or do something with it. And one of his first mistakes, spiritually speaking, is that he's at a point when he could share this with the needy, and it never enters his mind. You know, Jesus later on is going to tell his disciples, you need to sell what you have and give it to the poor, and then you'll have treasures in heaven. This is a passage here in Luke 12 that's pretty much similar to Matthew 6 in the Sermon on the Mount. And we don't know if Jesus taught both these lessons at different times or if Luke is placing this at this particular instance, but regardless, it has a good application. This man did not share what he had with others, so he's thinking of himself and not thinking about others. The second mistake he makes is that when he decides what he's going to do, he does not include God in his plans. He says, "This is what I'm going to do." James talks about the person who says, I'm going to go this next year into this city or that city, and I'm going to do business, and I'm going to make a profit. And he says, you don't know what your tomorrow is going to be. He talks about how brief life is and how uncertain it is. He said, instead, you should have said, if God wills, we will do this and we will do that. And he said, as such, you're boasting about tomorrow. And he said, all such boasting is evil. And what this man does in excluding God from making his plans is evil. He's leaving God completely out. And then when he thinks ahead to what life's going to be like after he gets all of his barns filled, he's thinking very selfishly. He's thinking, well, I'm just going to take it easy. And in that statement, there is no hint whatsoever that he has any plans to do anything in God's kingdom, anything for anyone else other than himself. And this is important because this is the situation that the man who interrupted Jesus is in. Greed and covetousness can take over a person's life. And so after he says this in verse 22, Jesus said to his disciples, for this reason, I say to you, don't be anxious about your life, about what you're going to eat, about your body, what you're going to put on. Jesus is saying, don't be like this person, and you are more sure that you're not going to be like this person if you don't start worrying and keep on worrying about your food, your clothing, your housing, things like that. Some of us have been told at various times in life when we started to say something or do something that someone has said, you don't want to go down that road. And when they told us that, we understood that to be a warning that what lay down that road was unpleasant, that what lay down that road might be a dead end, it might be harmful. But in other words, we were told, you don't want to go there. And Jesus is telling his disciples here, when you look at this man who's so interested in getting his brother to share the inheritance and whatever was involved with that, he didn't feel like he's being treated fairly. And you look at the story Jesus tells, it's an extreme story about a man who let possessions take over his life. And it reached the point where he thought of nothing other than himself and his possessions. And that is so true in life. There was a man who brought his son into his room one time, and he wanted his son to have a proper perspective on life. And he said, son, I want you to look out the window and tell me what you see. And his son looked out the window, looked down on the streets, and he said, I see people on the streets. And his father then brought out a mirror and set it before his son. And he said, now, son, tell me what you see. And he looked in the mirror and he said, I see myself. And the father said, do you see? Both are pieces of glass, but no sooner is a little silver added to one piece of glass, and you stop seeing others to only see yourself. And that's what possessions do, especially when possessions possess us. So Jesus, in talking to his disciples, in telling them not to be anxious about tomorrow, not to be anxious about their clothing and etc., is telling them don't even get started with possessions. And he said, don't worry about these things. Don't waste your mind's time worrying about this. And he asked the question, which one of you, by being anxious, can add a single cubit to his lifespan? You think about it. If you use your mind and you think really hard, what can you accomplish? Can you make your life go longer? Can you make yourself taller? If you concentrate really hard, can you make one hair not turn white and turn back black? you can't do it. And Jesus said, those are small things compared to the great things of your life and your spiritual life. And since you can't control those things, don't get started worrying about them. And he talks about how God will take care of us and God will array the grass of the fields. And he gives us this confidence that we can trust God so we don't have to worry about doing these things ourselves. And the next step is you need to be putting up treasures in heaven. Now, the man here is guilty because he was not rich toward God. What does it mean to be rich toward God? It means to do the things that God wants you to do, particularly the things that help others. John told his disciples, if you've got 2 coats, give one to the man who has none. He that has food to do likewise. Jesus is going to tell them in verse 33 of Luke 12, sell your possessions and give to charity. Make yourselves purses that do not wear out, an unfailing treasure in heaven. Now, when he says, sell what you have and give it to charity or give it to the poor, we sometimes take that as just a direct command. Well, then, does that mean we need to sell everything we have and just give it away? That seems to be the message that Jesus gave to the rich young ruler. But in that case, the rich young ruler, he was telling the rich young ruler to come and follow me. And he made the same request he made of him that he made of the other disciples. He told Peter and Andrew, James and John, leave your nets, leave your fishing business, come follow me. When he called Matthew the publican, Matthew left his tax tables where he was doing business. It was understood by them that an invitation from Jesus to follow me meant to make me full-time. When we look at this passage, however, and others, particularly when John told his disciples what to do, they're not told to sell everything, give everything away. And I don't believe that's the case here either in verse 33. In the context here, the rich man had surplus. What he should have done with the surplus that he couldn't use was to make it available to those who are in need. And I think that's what Jesus means in verse 33. Sell your possessions, give it to the poor. This is going to keep you from accumulating and accumulating. Who knows a rich man who is not trying to make more? Who knows a multimillionaire who is truly content? Pretty much no one, because these things tend to take over our lives. And after Jesus telling them what not to do, don't leave the other people out, don't leave God out, don't make yourself the sole determining factor of everything in your life so that you're only seeing yourself and your own wants, your own desires. He then tells them, first of all, get out of the habit of being worried and thinking that you have to provide everything yourself. Trust God. He will take care of you. And then take those things that you have and you have too much of and share them with others. And then have a treasure that doesn't wear out. Our purses, our wallets, they do wear out over time. And you might put money in a bag that's worn out and you lose it. But Jesus is telling us we have an assurance that if we give these things to God by our deeds, by giving them to others, that's not going to be a purse that wears out. We're not going to lose any of that. And after Jesus telling them all of this, he tells them in the last part of the chapter, you need to be dressed in readiness. You need to be prepared. Be like the slave whose master leaves and then comes back. Be on the alert because you don't know when your master is returning. Now, how many of us have had friends or relatives tell us we're going to be over at a certain time and we are setting our schedule based on that and getting things ready, and then they show up 2 hours early? We're not very happy with them because we're not ready. But they told us a time, and we were trusting that. Jesus doesn't tell us a time of his return. When he talks to John in Revelation and says, I come quickly, he is telling them how he's coming, not when. Because it's been 2,000 years since John's revelation from Jesus, and Jesus has not come. So we know he didn't mean soon, but he said quickly, and quickly is a how. When a person comes quickly, that means they come suddenly and sometimes unexpectedly. So Jesus hasn't given us a time when he's returning so that we can wait and get ready at our leisure, or wait and hurry things up right before he gets here. He's telling us, when I come, I'm going to come quickly, and you're not going to have time to do everything you need to do in order to be ready. So the answer to that is, when he tells us he's coming again, we need to be ready at all times. That means we need to be ready today, and tomorrow we need to be ready tomorrow. We need to keep our lives ready so that we're not ashamed when he comes back. When Peter heard all of this, he asked Jesus, are you talking to us, or are you talking to everyone as well? And Jesus said, who is the faithful and sensible steward that his master is going to put in charge of all of his servants to give them the rations at the proper time? Blessed is the slave whom his master finds so doing when he comes. I'll tell you truly, he will put him in charge of all of his possessions. And that answer says this: are you God's servant? Are you a steward of what God has given you? And the answer obviously is yes, we are. And then we have our answer. It applies to us. Peter has his answer. It applies to everyone, including Peter. And that means we need to be ready, because Jesus will come at a time, he tells us in Matthew 24, when men don't expect him. So what we need to be doing is to be guarding our lives. Don't let possessions take hold of us to the extent that we're like that man in verse 13, whose mind is on possessions, and he's upset because he thinks he's not being treated fairly. It's all he can think about. Don't be that kind of person. Set your mind on higher things. God's going to take care of our daily needs. And beyond that, let's just let God handle things. And let's be sharing when we have too much with those who don't have enough. And let's include God in all of our plans. What we're going to do tomorrow, let's say if God wills this, let's do that. Let's look into God's Word and see what God is wanting us to do tomorrow. And then let's decide accordingly. But above all, let's be ready. Let's be prepared. Because the rich man was told, tonight, your soul is required. We don't know when ours is going to be required by God. We just know that it will one day. And my plea to you is to make sure you are ready. Become a Christian if you're not a Christian. How do you do that? You're baptized into Jesus Christ upon the confession of your faith in him. And then live accordingly your life from then on. May God bless you, and we hope to see you soon.